The world is only using a fraction of the power of Power BI. Turning Power BI into a two-way read and write interface opens up all kinds of possibilities, especially true for those organizations interested in driving higher financial and operational performance. De facto Power Planning takes the potential of Power BI and Dynamics 365 ERP systems to a unique and unprecedented level. It gives D365 users the unique ability to write data directly back to Power Platform, Power BI, D365, or any other data source. As soon as that data is input into Power BI, it automatically updates all Power BI visuals and data in de facto Power Planning. And all of this can happen inside D365 and without the use of a specialized Power app. See for yourself at defactoglobal.com.
Please welcome our next speaker, Scott Frappier, a pre-sales architect. Today, he will be presenting Harnessing the Power of Data with PP and D365 FO SCM. Please stick around after Scott's session for a live Q&A.
Hello and welcome. What an exciting event this has been so far. First off, I just wanted to send a very quick thank you to the DynamicsCon team for being able to take the time to guide me through the recording of this particular session. I'm super excited to get into the details with all of you today. I really appreciate the votes that we got to be able to go through and broadcast this content today. And so, yeah, just a big thank you just to kind of start off this session as we go through it. So, if you haven't been to this session or if you haven't read about it, really what we're focusing on today is harnessing the power of data on Microsoft Dynamics and the Power Platform. So, if this isn't the session that you wanted to take a look at, I still recommend that you stay on here to kind of see what the capabilities are. But the thing to note here is that we're really going to be focusing on Dynamics 365 finance and operations apps, which is finance, supply chain management, and some of the other apps that we use day in and day out, along with the Power Platform capabilities. And how can we actually use this to manage data as part of this process? So, with that, let's get into this a little bit more in detail and kind of understand what's our agenda for this particular topic today. So, a couple of things to note. Obviously, I want to do an introduction. You may or may not know me. I'd like you to know where I come from, what my background is, and why I'm so passionate about this particular product and these capabilities. I want to frame this a different way for you. When we look at this from a technologist perspective, we look at it really from a really technical perspective in a lot of ways. And what I want to do is I want to back that up a little bit. I want us to start talking about really what's important typically to an end user when they're using this platform, and that is data, right? It's one of the themes that we use at our organization to really drive the capabilities and how we address those within a business system process. So, with that, though, we also need to understand where our data is. Some of you that are out in the audience right now have different stages in your life cycle as to what you've implemented on Dynamics 365. How do you access that data? How do you use the platform to your advantage and then unify that as well as you go through the process? So, I want to talk a bit about that as well so that you know what you should be looking for as you go through this. Then what we want to do is obviously cover some of the important topics that really are the Power Platform, right? If we're talking about harnessing data, what tools do we use to actually harness that data? So Power Automate, Power Apps, Power BI, Power Virtual Agents, Power, right? We want to show each of those particular use cases. And what we want to do in this session is really show you then the business requirements that we're trying to tackle as part of this process, not just put something on the screen, make it look flashy. We want to talk through how do you actually use these tools to address requests that help you increase customer satisfaction, that help you automate your job responsibilities, that help you interact with your customers, that help you save time, right? And to also help you report off of data and visibility with this. And then kind of finally here, I know we're not focusing entirely on Dataverse within this particular conversation, But we need to mention it. We need to talk through a little bit of what you need to consider as you move, for example, to this more unified vision of what Dynamics 365 supports as your long term app strategy. So that's kind of the overview here. We're going to sprinkle in IoT, machine learning, and some of those other aspects as we go through this. We're going to create things. We're just going to have a lot of fun as we really go through this. So, quick introduction. My name is Scott Frappier. I'm a pre-sales architect at Stoneridge Software. I have over 20 years of experience in Microsoft Dynamics, and I've focused on many different roles in my tenure. I've been a PM, developer, owned my own company, and joined the Stoneridge Software organization about 7 years ago. And really, what I focus on is helping customers and our clients and prospects understand what tools you use to be able to address business system requirements. Typically, I'm assisting with CIOs, CTOs from multi-million dollar organizations on up to understand the strategy that they need to implement in order to support the business. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is showing end users what the capability is to be able to drive really their business processes that they have. And the one thing that we talked about at the beginning here is really about data. Data is the key that we tackle as part of our processes and is what I want you to think about as you go through your process on how you tackle and use these different tools to address the requirements that you have. And what I mean by that is that if we use the standard Microsoft slides that we have here, when we look at digital transformation, what we're really saying is that this is really driven by data decisions, right? We're looking to engage, optimize, empower, and transform. And we use those interchangeably in a lot of ways. We may be transforming products, for example, or if we're in a distribution environment, but maybe we want to engage vendors as well with vendor collaboration, right? What we're really saying here is that we want to use data to be able to drive some of that optimization and empowerment that the platform really natively supplies as part of its capabilities. And the cool thing about this is that we're looking at a sliver of what we're able to access as part of the Dynamics 365 solution. And what I mean by that is if you start with data as the basis with it, you can use data and put it in different areas to store that particular data. You can use intelligence like machine learning, even on the Power Platform, to make your tasks easier and more automated as part of that process. You can use the Power Platform itself to design applications that access that data and address those business system requirements. You can use Office 365 and Dynamics 365 to use, business processes that have business events inside of them to make it so that you can then use automates or flows to automate then those particular actions. And then you can use partners to help educate you to be able to cut down on the services costs that you may incur if you go through a partner to address a custom app every single time, right? This is the cloud platform. And this is what we really tout as part of the vision of what Microsoft is trying to accomplish. Today, like you saw, we're focusing on one area. We're focusing on Power Platform. How do we use Power Platform to enable our users to empower, to integrate, to do all those different types of actions around data? And that's what we're going to be drilling into today in more detail. From a data perspective, though, what we need to start thinking about are a couple of things. And this is just advice from me to you as an end user. If I look at it from an end user perspective with this, number one, starting your conversations around data that you need in order to accomplish a task is probably the most important step that you'll make as part of your endeavor when you're looking at these solutions. You want to focus initially more on the data and not as much on the look and feel. And this is something that people get trapped in as they go through system design continually. And the way we tackled it in the past was that if we had an ERP application, if it felt like it was kind of ERP-ish, we would design it inside the ERP application, right? And there's lots of cost and customization issues that can come in place with that. So what we want to do is we want to focus on the process and understand what are the inputs and outputs that you need from data to be able to tackle or accomplish that particular process. What you also need to understand is that this is going to be trial and error, right? When you start getting into the Power Platform and start accessing finance and operations data, it's new. Like the entities that you're going to access, you're not going to know entirely where to go with that. So obviously trial and error is good to be able to address some of that. But at the same point today, I want to show you some tools that you can use as well to expedite your learning to really understand that data structure. And remember, you always have partners to rely on or even the community to rely on to ask more detailed questions with it. And remember as well, there are limits that you may be able to do on the Power Platform. There may be limits that are because of your governance that you have internally. There may be limits in terms of how your data architecture works. You need to work within your organization's security and boundaries to be able to really understand then what those are. And those are going to deviate from customer to customer. In my presentation today, I'm going to access it through standard tools that we generally implement as part of our process to support the Dynamics 365 application. And you should be able to have access then to these as part of your implementation plan. So, like I said, the theme is data. We're harnessing data. We start with data, we end with data, and we use these tools to transform data as we go through our processing. So, the first question you have to ask yourself really is, where is my data at, right? There are two primary concepts in Dynamics 365 right now. I call them the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps, and I know Microsoft's documentation references it like that as well. And then the Dynamics 365 model driven apps. And really, when we look at those particular topics, we look at, for example, finance, supply chain management, commerce, and human resources. They're in the finance and operations apps. They're what AX 2012 was that became the cloud product that now is the ERP-ish type applications that are out there. And the CRM, the Dynamics 2016 or whatever version it was, Dynamics CRM became the sales, customer service, field service, and marketing apps. And those are model driven apps inside of our environment. Now, depending upon where you're at, you can access this data layer or make changes between them, and they will synchronize as well. And so, this is something that you need to consider as we go through this particular conversation. Today, what we're focusing on more is the finance and operations applications. How do I use the Power Platform to directly integrate with those particular applications to create events, to create Power Apps, to access the data, to use Power BI to do visualizations? Like, how do I do that, right? But remember as well, with some of the technologies that are there, and we're going to show the concept here today as well, you can also develop in Dataverse. And Dataverse is the database that drives sales, customer service, field service, and marketing, right? So there are opportunity areas for you to be able to extend the solution without customizing then Dynamics 365 finance and operations apps, because you can create, for example, new tables inside of the Dataverse if you wanted to. And these are concepts that our customers are continually using and are very excited about because it allows for them to really control how they interact with their data. So, with that, where do I create, right? So, Scott, sum it up. What would I want to create, or where would I create those particular ones? So, first off, if you have finance and supply chain management or finance and operations apps, any of those, you don't need Dataverse. You can access Power BI, Power Apps, all of those Power Platform applications directly to the finance and operation apps database. So, you don't need to have a Dataverse for it. I'd recommend you consider having Dataverse because I think there's some big strategic advantages from an organizational perspective long term. But for the scope of this, if you don't have it, don't worry about it. The next portion of this, remember, is that we do have those native connectors, like I mentioned. And if you want to use Dataverse, our jobs become easier because you can create custom tables. You can access some of the newer capabilities, for example, using Dataverse as well. But like I said, we're going to sprinkle that in here, but we're really going to focus then on the FinOps capabilities, the FinOps apps with it. So first off, let's talk about Power Automate, right? One of the most common tasks that I ever get asked in any implementation process that I go through is I want to I want basically the system to do this when something happens, right? I want to have an approval sent out for credit limits. I want to have when an order is delivered, I want a customer to get an email with it. I want to have when an order is 10 days past due, I want the system to send me an email, to send me a text message, to create a record, to so on and so forth, right? It's common everywhere. And the way that we tackled this in the past as implementers is that we wrote code to do it, right? We'd go into there, find where the event was occurring or when the data was being changed, and we would hook into that data. We'd overlayer it, as we would call it in the old environment. And then from there, we would then basically perform that task, right? And that, as you can imagine, creates a lot of problems for customers, even though it's automation type customizations, right? It's still a customization and it still needs to be looked at as part of that upgrade process. So is there a better way to do that? And what we typically start pointing our clients and customers towards is using Power Automate to tackle these particular tasks. So, allowing for us to focus on data really allows for us to identify what changes and when we want something to occur based off of that data event or condition, right? That's really what we're trying to say here as part of this process is that we're trying to say when, for example, an order goes to delivered, I want it to send out some type of notification with it, or I want some hook when data changes to be able to send that notification out. So, with that, when we start looking at it from that perspective, we call that eventing. Subscriptions is another common term that's used with it, where when something happens, we want another particular action to occur as well. And in the end user world, we don't need to call it eventing. We can just use Power Automate to be able to tackle these types of capabilities. And the easiest way out of the box to handle this is to use the business events capabilities that we have within Dynamics 365 to really drive that process. So let's go through and take a look at that. I'm going to go into my environment, and here we have, for example, my demo environment, right? So Contoso Manufacturing, I got my pre-sales demo set up for it, and basically I'm in finance and operations inside of here. Now, one of the cool capabilities that we have is if we go into our modules and we go into our system administration as an example, what we're going to see is we've got a lot of different options that are inside of here, right? But what we also have is an area called the business events framework. And this business event framework really allows for us then to use external automations to be able to then integrate and then to be notified as part of that integration process. And remember, if you want to, if you don't have it on your menu, you can go to business events, for example, let the system go through and search, and then you should be able to see, for example, that business events catalog that you may have that you can then integrate with. Now, as an end user, this is overwhelming, right? This is something that typically somebody that's configuring the system would tackle, right? So let's back up and let's look at it from an end user perspective. How do I make the system do something when an action occurs? First off, let's go into Power Automate. So in Power Automate, so now I'm basically www.powerapps.com. In Power Automate, I'm able to go to my flows as an example here. And in my flow, as I navigate into here, what I should be able to do is generate a new flow, right? To be able to access the Dynamics 365 data. So if I click on my new flow and I do an automated cloud flow as an example here, I can skip my connection points that are inside of here and basically just open up my designer then to interact with basically what I'm going to design in this particular flow. And what I want to show you here today are a couple of tips and tricks that you can use that really expedite how you interact with your data inside of the system. Now, the first thing that you're going to look for, obviously, is changing the name to something. So, what I can do is I can say when a customer changes, as an example of a name. So, make sure you just name your flow so you understand what it is. Inside of here, what I can do is I can look for my finance and operations apps, right? So you can see I typed in Fin, and you can see right here we have a connector for Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, right? Fantastic start so far, right? Easy peasy. Go ahead and click on it. And we can see here now that when a business event occurs, this is an option that I have then to be able to integrate with Dynamics 365 when something is occurring inside of it. And I know some of the developers that are going to be on the call are going to be like, oh, well, wait a second. We have to create those events. And I want to show as an end user how you can get around that. Because hopefully in the future, we'll have more capabilities here. But for now, how do I get past those limitations that involve a developer for it, right? I want to empower the end user. Cool thing though is if when I go to when a business event occurs and I go into my instance, so you're going to have an environment that you typically go through and interact with. You can see in my demo environments, I've got a lot of different types of environments that are in here, right? But really what I'm looking for is my pre-sales demo environment that I'm interacting with. I'm able to go through and then select, for example, different categories that I'm going to have these particular business events. So an example would be if I want it so that when an accounts receivable particular action is occurring, for example, when an interest note is posted, or when a payment is posted, or when a transaction is written off, these are native events that have been added into Dynamics 365 that you, as an end user, can hook onto. And so you can see here that we've got a couple of different areas that allow for us then to integrate with this. An example would be sales orders. If I need to have a notification sent to a customer that an invoice has been generated for a particular sales order, and I want to attach more details or a thank you or a follow-up email with it, basically, when an invoice is created, I can say, as an example here, if I go to USMF as my company and my legal entity, when this event occurs, that I want to take another action. I want to mail, as an example, and I want to send that email to Scott Frappier, for example, as part of that particular process. So you're able to go through within Power Automate here and then make it so that when a particular event occurs, that the system will then respond to that event, right? And that's really convenient. If you have these events that are here, you can basically go ahead and hook into that, and then you're good. You're able to go through and start the processing with it. Now, as an end user, though, first thing that you're going to recognize with this is like, well, I need to pass values to it. I want to tailor it a little bit more. Or the most common one, the event doesn't exist. I want to make it so that when a sales order is delivered, that it sends a shipping notification out, right? So how can we get around that? How can we tackle that type of a business requirement from an end user perspective? Cool feature that we have to tackle that. Let's go back into Dynamics. So what I want to do here is I want to make it so that when a particular event occurs, that it's going to send something to Power Automate. And I want to make a flow then that says when this event occurs, do a particular action. So to do that, an example would be I can go to my sales order processing and inquiry screen. I'm going to go to my sales orders. I'm going to go to my options at the top here. And on my options, I'm going to create a custom alert. On my custom alert, I'm going to say that any time that the status field, so I can actually come into here, type in, for example, status, and find that particular value. So we should see status that's inside of here. Select that, and I can say when it is set to, for example, delivered in this example. So full shipment is delivered because I don't want to send partial shipment notifications as an example. I want the system to go through and then send this externally to something as a particular action. And maybe I want to say additional details that are inside of this message. So here's some detail, pitter patter, right? Let's get at her. All right. Let's go ahead and click on OK to create that particular rule. Basically, what I've done now from an end user perspective is I've said that any time that I get a delivered status with it, I could have put more filters on it. I could have said when this particular condition occurs, or I can just set up globally and then use Power Automate to filter through some of those particular conditions. And the reason I set that up really is to highlight the fact that now that I have that particular alert set up, in the Power Platform, for example, what I can do is I can use a category of alerts inside of the system. And when I select alerts that are occurring, what I can do is I can actually go through and say when an alert rule is triggered that I want it to then run through this particular process, right? So you can go through and then tailor this to really match then alert capabilities that are occurring. So another example of that, I'll make it easier so we can show one live on here. Let's go into my customers. Let's go ahead and say for that any customer, when I actually have an alert, I want to basically create a custom alert. on that customer alert, I want to do it for just Contoso Europe is what we'll do as part of this. For that record, what we're going to say is the name is what we'll use for the value inside of here. So the organization name, I think, is what we would be actually looking at with it. Okay. Our account number or any value really. So actually, in fact, I'll do credit limit. I think that's a great one to play around with here. So credit limit wise, whenever that's been changed, just for this particular one, I want to have it actually send it to Flow so that I can actually then be notified of it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK to that. Now from there now, I have that set up as a change, right? A change-based event that could occur with it. And really what we're going to do here is if I go into my automate portion of this and I actually go ahead and save this away, we now have the content with it. It's telling me I got to put my subject in and then put my body, more info, and then save that away. And then I can go through and then basically test that as part of this. So once this has gone through and saved, what I should be able to do is actually test this particular one. And we'll test it with that one as an example. If I click on test and I say then I want to actually perform the trigger action for it inside of here, you can see from a Power Automate perspective, I can actually have the system then interact with it. I'm going to go into my customer, for example, Contoso Europe, and I'm going to change the credit limit that's related to it to be able to make those changes. So I come inside of here, I change my credit limit to $500 or $50,000, and I save it away. And really what happens in the background here is when we're making these types of modifications, there are processes that typically run in the background that maintain then these particular business events. And one of those is going to be, from the event perspective, is that there's changes that actually occur as well. There's actually a business event change. So if we look at our events that are inside of here, we're going to see that there's a bunch of business event catalogs, parameters, and there's also processes that run as part of this. And what happens when those particular processes run, so there's cancellation, cleanup events, there's order events, there's all these different types of events. But when those particular events run, what they'll do is they'll actually catch the change events that are inside of here as well. And the reason I'm just highlighting this is that these change-based alerts that we have inside of the system, when this process runs, this is when it's actually going through and then taking that information and then sending it to Power Automate so that you can then take a subsequent action with it. And hopefully in a bit here, as we're talking through this, we're going to see that eventually here, that particular alert is going to come up because that record did change as part of that particular process. And we should be able to see the detail of what's contained inside of there. And as you can see, we see the update that occurred, we see the business event that occurred, and we see the data that came through here as well from that particular business event. Now you can go further than this then as well. And I don't want to get into Power Automate design patterns inside of here from an end user perspective. But if you want to, for example, add an action, and on that action, I want to parse JSON is what we would call it, because that data that we saw that was in there was actually what we called JSON. And I'm going to take the body from when the business event occurs. And then I'm going to generate from that sample. I copied the example that I had inside of here for all the fields that are needed for it. And I click done to that. Now from there, and I know you'll be able to pause this video to look at this, I can now access, for example, those particular fields that are inside of here, the key, the value. I can, for example, add a grabbing of that record. So now that I've actually updated that, I could say, you know what, I want another action inside of here from a finance and operations perspective that I want to go through and then I want to grab that particular record. And I want to go into that pre-sales environment and I want to basically grab then that customer record as part of that transaction. And so I'm going to find my entity and I would say, for example, the customers V3 as part of this. There's our customers V3 entity. And then I could specify as an example here that I want to have this and this as the key value that I use to be able to grab that particular record, right? And what I could do is I could save this then and I can test it through on the fly and I don't need to resubmit it. I can actually take it with a recently run one inside of Power Automate and test that and then see how the system reacts without changing that data inside of that particular area. And we can see here now that when we did that, not only now do I have a business event that told me that the customer changed for a credit limit, I actually have every single value that's inside of here for the fields that are on the customer entity that I can interact with. So I can add conditionals and all these different things to be able to tackle a particular Power Automate. How far can you go with this? Is the question I get. I want to show a production environment. In my production environment, I have a solution inside of here. In my solution, I should have some Teams integration that we created that helps us automate the generation of Active Directory, of graph, what we call based technologies as well, to basically go through and create team sites, right? Pretty cool. So here, when we look at something that's even more complex with it, this is an example of a flow that we've gone through and added that has conditionals, that allows for us to create errors, that really allows for us to really use the capabilities in a lot more detail compared to what we're just showing in this simple example, right? So we'll let that load in the background. Just know with Power Automate, if you have an action that you need to tackle, it's a great tool to use to be able to tackle those conditions. Now, continuing on here, just in the interest of time, let's talk a little bit of Power Apps. Another common scenario that we get is that we want to modify a screen because it's too busy. I don't like the interface of this. They only need certain amounts of data. I don't want to set up and customize, the form for this particular user, right? And when we develop, for example, in X++, it's not really for an end user, right? If you want to create a quick app, you're not doing it typically in X++ to do that. And if we focus on our concept of data, what we can do is we can use a concept called the entity framework inside of Power Apps to access then the finance and operations apps data as part of that. And it allows for us to very rapidly create applications that we can interact with. So to that point, we'll come back over here. Here's our flow that we were looking at. Look at how complex that can get, right? So pretty cool that we have conditionals and data with here. Sky's the limit from an end user perspective. You can have a lot of fun with that. Let's go to our Power Apps real quick. And in our Power Apps, I should have a demo environment still, my CE and FinOps demo environments. If I look at my apps that are inside of here, I've got an example that I generated for this already. And in my example, basically what I did is I created a Power App and then I pointed it to the customer's V3 entity inside of our system. Now, there's tons of documentation on how to do this. The high level aspect of it, if I actually go into the edit mode here, is that when you're setting up your app, what you're going to do is you're going to use, just like you did in Power Automate, you're going to create a connection to your Dynamics 365 environment. And when you set up that connection, you're going to be able to then go through and do those particular transactions. So while that's loading up in the background, let's take a quick look at this application. You have a requirement where you need to be able to add new customers, but you don't want to give them access to the customer master to do that. You want to regulate it, for example, from a Power App, and you want to do it from a phone. Well, in this condition, as the example with it, what I could do is I can create a new record, USMF. I can give it a fake number here. I can say what my organization name is going to be as part of this. So, cool demo. And what I can do is I can say USD and a customer group of 10. And obviously, as an end user, as you get more into this, you can do more things, such as making this so that you can do lookups and select values and do defaults that are related to it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on Save to this. Now, when I've done this, what happens in the background from the system's perspective is that it actually goes through and updates Dynamics 365 through Power Automate. And I'm not using anything more in my connections, as you can see here, than referencing, for example, this particular data connection that I'm interacting with. I'm not going to Dataverse. I'm not creating a flow to do it. I'm not doing any interim steps. I'm directly accessing the entity to interact with it. Now, inside of our system now, if I actually go to my sales order processing and inquiry, and I go to my customers inside of here, we should hopefully see, hey, there's that cool demo that's inside of here. And even cooler beyond that, hey, now I want to make it so that I want to add some address information. So my super cool address, and I can't type, 55110, I don't know, 3488 Midland Court. Save it away. Good to go. Let's go back to our Power App now, right? We expect to see that data as we go through this, right? To our Power App, refresh the screen, hope it works because this is demos and we all know how demos go, right, as we go through a process. And what we should see here, look at that. The address information came through. And if I want to edit my delivery address, or if I want to edit that information inside of here, I could if I wanted to. I can restrict or make it easier for people to interact with the Power App. Now, you can take this pretty far, and I want to just highlight it. We're talking about real use cases here as well. Inside of one of my other environments that I have, we have an example of an application that we built that addresses some of the plant management requirements for one of our customers that we had. We're able to, for example, look up inventory in this particular application. So that way we've got a really quick view of inventory quantities that we have that are accessible. So I can see, for example, in my demo environment, the quantities I have on hand of a particular product. I can take, for example, requisitions and generate new requisitions inside of here. I can also, really interestingly, use advanced capabilities such as machine learning inside of here. So that way I can take pictures of documents and use, for example, then the OCR capabilities that we have on the Power Platform from an image recognition capability, and then have it populate additional detail inside of here that is from handwritten text. So if you think about some of the concepts and ideas that you can integrate them with the Power App, it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to tackle those types of capabilities. So that's kind of with the Power Apps here. Let's keep on moving. Some of the Power BI aspects, this is generally an area that everyone always uses, right? And so there's a lot of strategies that are around how we actually interact with Power BI within Dynamics 365. And really, I'm not here to talk about the concepts of or the scope today of bringing your own database or data lakes or data warehouses with it. What I want to show you is how do you get data into Power BI to interact with it? Or how do you use that data in a more meaningful fashion? Because I'm sure you've seen many videos on how you actually integrate, for example, Power BI as part of your process. But have you ever thought about using it to actually drive a process instead of just doing a dashboard? So let's show that. Inside of my environment, what we're going to do is we're going to move away from a static perspective and an interactive perspective. And we're kind of moving away from predictions with this as well. We're getting into the decision support area. And a lot of people, when they see this slide, they're like, this is the what you're trying to pursue as part of your BI automation, right? But how do you get to support with it? How do you make it so that a report can have action inside of it as well? Right? Not just a consumption device, an output device as well as you go through that. And this is a really cool concept that I think people need to really start considering. So if I go now into, for example, my environment again, and in the Power Platform here, what I want to do is I want to go into my manufacturing space. In my manufacturing space, if I actually go to my production floor management, I have some Power BI reports that I created that have been integrated inside of here. One of those reports that I have is what we call our review operational cycle times that's been set up. And what it's doing is it's looking at the data, the work center data basically, to identify what our efficiency rates are inside of the environment. Now, as you can see here, when I click on the Power BI portion of this, you see that it opens up a standard type of dashboard report, right? There's nothing really fancy here. But then look to the right a little bit. This is the example of a Power App being embedded inside of Power BI that's looking at data that exists inside of Dynamics 365. And the cool thing about this is that you can make these reports where they interact then with the Power Platform, with the Power App. So if you want to, for example, make it so that you have somebody that's monitoring times and you want them to be able to come into a Power App to then go through and then update, for example, setup times right now. Nope, they're really at 4 at this point. So that's updating a routing or updating a production order. You can do this all within then a particular report inside of you. You can do that within the actual environment, within Power BI to be able to tackle this, right? And so this is the concept of then taking that Power App that we talked about and then bringing it then into Power BI so that you can have decisions and support occur with it as you go through your processing. So, a really cool capability, something that I wanted to highlight from a data perspective that really allows you to interact and harness that data from that perspective. And kind of one of the last areas here is our Power Virtual Agents, right? So when we start talking about Power Platform, Power Virtual Agents is something that doesn't come up that often, but it's something that probably should. And the reason I want to highlight that is really because of this. Now, from an end user perspective, what I can do with Power Virtual Agents here is something that's pretty dang cool. I can, for example, come into my times that I have, and then going to go into, for example, my customer credit and collections. And in my customer credit and collections, I have a Power App that I added. Remember, you can add Power Apps directly into Dynamics 365 as well. And in here, I'm going to say, hello from a customer credit and collections inquiry. This is a bot that's running. Great, it's my credit and collections app. How can I help you? I want to know my top receivable risk, right? Okay, type that in. Fantastic. What it's going to do is it's actually going to say, okay, I'm going to check that out for you, hopefully. Checking out who has the largest amount due, because that's what I set up my bot to basically look for when I use those types of keywords. Tells me for Pure Farms, looks like it's the highest risk one at this point in time. I can select that, and then I can also even navigate then to that particular record to interact with it, right? Such cool capabilities that you get then with being able to then use Power Virtual Agents to basically define this particular bot from an end user perspective and then put that into Dynamics 365 to be able to access that information. And I've got to kind of wrap this up really quickly. We're getting to time, but what about Dataverse? Okay. What happens if you do have Dataverse and you want to use, for example, a model driven app, or you want to actually save data into Dataverse because you do have Dynamics 365 sales, for example, and you do have dual write enabled with it? Well, the cool thing about this entire presentation is that this entire time we were saving data into Dataverse as well, and you didn't even know it. And here's the cool thing about it. Let me go into Dataverse just really quickly and show you. So inside of our environment here, if I can just get things kind of moved out of the way, I'm going to go into our Power Platform and I'm going to open up the environment just really quickly here. And what we should see on our accounts as we go into here, remember we generated that new customer that we were interacting with. And when we generated that customer, what we should see on our accounts is that name. So if we manage our customers here and we go to our all customers just really quickly here on our sales order and inquiry and processing screen, and I click on, oops, of course, in the interest of time, I click on the wrong one. I click on my all customers that's inside of here, and we see cool demo, right? It's right there. So now if we actually go to our accounts and search for cool demo, that's in here as well. Hopefully we're going to see it. There it is. I could actually create a model driven app off of this. I could actually take it and save it inside of Power BI inside of here. I can access the information because I've enabled dual write capabilities within Dynamics 365 as part of this as well. So not only when you create an app, for example, that's connecting to Dynamics 365 finance and operations databases, if you're using the underlying technologies from an organizational perspective, when you create a record in finance and supply chain management, it's going to create a record inside of Dynamics 365 for sales as well, which allows you to do even more than from a Power Platform perspective. So, kind of with that, let's wrap it up. Remember, frame your conversations around data. Look at what you want to address from a data perspective with it. Use Power Automate to really drive those automation requirements that you have. Use Power Apps to create those front ends that you want to interact with data, and know that you can take those Power Apps and use them in Power BI or use those same applications within finance and operations. You can also use Power Virtual Agents not just for customers, but for internal processes that you can tackle to really automate and support your staff. And then obviously tackle more with Dataverse. If you want to have data duplication or deduplication within it, if you want to use the business processes that are inside of Dynamics 365 for sales, don't be scared. Go ahead and enable that dual write capability, get the support you need, and then from there, access that and build apps out of that. And I would say the biggest thing here of all, have fun. This is a lot to tackle for your first session. There's a lot of different areas and a lot of different setups that are needed for it. Just make sure to have fun and keep exploring and trying new things. So, kind of with that, thank you everyone for joining and participating in this session. I want to put a big shout out to DynamicsCon for being able to help me through this process and going through and getting the content put together. I think it's been an awesome event. And then also in the chat, if you have questions, make sure if you haven't asked them already that you ask them now. I'd be more than happy to take them and field them and answer any questions you have. Thank you. And now it looks like we're in the question and answer phase. So hopefully you guys enjoyed a lot of that content. I will tell you it was weird to watch what was going on and at the same time then see chat. I was hoping some of you had some questions to ask as part of that content that I showed. So with that, I'll just kind of monitor chat here and just kind of wait for any questions that you may have. And if you don't, what I can also do is talk about some of the things that came out in chat that basically have, additional details with it. So one would be, obviously, as we were going through that, a lot of the times I didn't actually show you that connection perspective, right? I didn't actually go through and then manually go and look at the entity list that was part of it. In the chat, thanks, Greg, appreciate it. In the chat, I actually mentioned that one of the things that you can do from an end user perspective to understand what data you can interact with is to go into Excel, go into the get data area, and basically what you can do is you can actually go through and select the URL that you have and put the / data in that URL. And then basically what will happen is it will actually go through and query the entity list so that you can see all the different entities that you can interact with. So that's something just to note, if you want to be able to get to that data to see that information. I typically do that quite often when I'm going through a lot of my app design as part of my process. So that way I can basically query that data and then interact with it really as part of that entity level inside of Dynamics 365. Couple other things just to note as well. One would be that when we go through, for example, the Power Virtual Agents, one of the questions that came up in the Power App component with it, the refresh. And I this question right when it came up, I'm like, yeah, that would be a nice feature if they added or had some type of eventing mechanism with it. But basically, imagine you're on the customer card and you go through and you enter in a delivery address and you click save to it and you expand out a Power App, because you can take a Power App. I embedded it in the dashboard, in the workspace that I was interacting with, but you can also put Power Apps inside of the actual F&O card pages, for example. And inside of those pages, you can actually reference a value that you can carry over then into the Dynamics 360, or into the Power App as part of that process. And the one caveat with it is that when you expand and open that Power App initially, that's when the data gets transferred over to it. So it does a great job at then grabbing it. An example with the customer card, I made a map control because one of our requirements was that they needed a map. And so I'm like, well, why customize this? Let's just make a map control in a Power App, use the Google Maps or Bing Maps, depending upon where your allegiances lie. And then basically what I did is I went through and passed the customer information, and I used inside of that Power App a get portion of it to grab then the customer record, because I passed in the record number or the customer number, and then I displayed the address information. I showed a pin and I showed different shapes that were on it. It was actually pretty cool. But then when I updated the address and clicked on save, it didn't update inside of the Power App. So one of the things that I typically do now inside of my designs for Power App is I actually make a refresh action that you can click on then inside of the Power App, where it will grab the current information for that. So it's a pretty nice feature with that. So a couple other questions. Hi, Scott. Is there a release date for data lakes and D365 F&O? Is the GitHub project from the Fast Track viable for limited production environment usage? Fantastic question. I do not have all the answers with Data Lake, but I've got some of them for you here. One of them is that obviously there are phases that they are going through in introducing the Data Lake concept in production-based environments. So you hear concepts that we typically talk about inside of finance and supply chain management. We've got tables, we have entities, and then we have an entity store concept that's involved with it. In our environment right now, the entity store, there's different release dates that they've put on these for integration into a data lake. One of those that's actually supported from a general availability perspective, at least the last time I checked, was the entity stores being able to be updated in data lakes. A lot of my demo environments, I already enabled that, and I use that quite heavily. But the other ones, the entities, which are basically a grouping of tables to represent a single entity, like our customers V3, and also the tables are not considered general availability yet. From a delivery perspective, I know the question is, are they viable for limited production environment use? I would be very cautious with that. And the reason for it is that if you run into an issue with it, remember, once it's generally available, Microsoft will support that particular feature or function. But before that, if you're not part of the private previews for it, or have, like you said, the fast track assistance with it with your fast track solution architect, you might be in a bad position with it. So they have not stated explicitly when general availability occurs yet for those. I think in the last release wave, they may have updated that, but at this point, just know that it's still considered preview for those features. And so, there's a lot of people asking for it to get completed, and hopefully it will be soon, because then you can use Power BI, for example, then to access some of the entity data, as opposed to using Power BI to do an OData connection into the environment, which is not good from a reporting perspective. So hopefully that answers your question. I'd recommend against it until it's GA. I could say from a demo and sandbox perspective, you can start gearing up for it, because that is a feature I know that Microsoft has a lot of pressure under at this point to get done, because we need that capability, obviously, here, along with the archiving, right? That's another big one. Another question that Jake mentioned: how do you recommend managing that environment your app is connected to? Moving it from test, it looks like ACC prod. I'm as part of that. So I'm assuming test, development, prod, those full life cycles that are there, the configuration, as well, the config environment. In what I do with mine is that I'm using basically solutions to drive that. So I showed you when you went into the Power Platform, you went into there and you created a new Power App, right? Great for an end user perspective, great to be able to just make something very quickly and interact with it, but not very good from an IT administrative perspective. Typically, what we recommend with that is that we start following more of the solution concepts then with it. So instead of going directly to the app and creating the app, what we do is we actually go into the solution section, and in that solution section, we actually say create new Canvas app, model app, or custom connector, or enum, or entity. So that way we package everything then inside of a solution. And if you are from the Dynamics 365 CE, sales type environment, you know that there's things like managed and unmanaged solutions that you can create. You can actually do basically migrations. You can export that solution between the environments. You can have configs and data copy and triggers that you can run as part of those installations of those solutions. So if you really want to get it into a more managed type environment, typically you're going to go down that solution path to export, import, and then interact with that data as really your output for that process. And I'd highly recommend that in any production-based environment. So I've got another question from FaZe. Thanks for the question. Hi, Scott. I've got about 100 companies in D365 F&O. That's a lot of companies. And I don't want to create separate workflows for, let's say, General Journal in the 100 companies. Can I use Power Automate to design the workflow with amounts limits so that I can take the configuration and management of workflow completely out of D365 Finance into Power Automate? You could. So in my example, what I was doing in my solution is I was using a specific company for the alerts that would be inside of the solution. One thing that you could do, the business event framework that we had, is something that if you're looking for a single point of interaction, one thing that you would consider or could consider with that business event framework, if you have that scale of companies, the first question is Power Automate the right area potentially to centralize that? And I'm not saying it's not, but I'm also saying this sounds like this is a much more complex need. And when I start hearing that, I start actually leaning a little bit more towards Logic Apps. Logic Apps is actually like Power Automate, but it's designed for scale, so that if you have, for example, more complex requirements, for example, 100 companies, when a particular action occurs, you want to then have something else occur as part of it. You could use a Power Automate for it, but what you can do is you can use the business event framework to basically make it so that when data updates, that the system will call either a flow or a logic app to basically then do a subsequent action. And that could then be that it grabs the record in a different company, and then it grabs, for example, this additional data. You can absolutely do that. So that would move you away from using our workflow foundation, which is an app that you open up, as you probably know, for Gen Journals, that was designed in AX 2012, if I recall correctly. It's called the Windows Workflow Component or something like that. I'd highly recommend that you look at using then, for example, that business event framework, so that when that particular action occurs, it would actually go through and then call either a flow or an automate, and then you could use that to do your workflow management. You might have to add some code, for example, to hold a journal to make it so that it can't be posted, right? Because there's fields that you want that flow to update as well, but it's not something that's impossible to do, and it would be pretty easy to, for example, extend minimally some of the Dynamics 365 finance components so that that entity or an entity exists where you can update those fields so you can manage it then from a Power Automate perspective. So I think there's a little bit of a combination that you'd probably have to do from an extension perspective, but that's the point of it, right? You can do an extension without modifying the base layer. And if you're just exposing data as part of that upgrade lifecycle, more often than not, you're not going to run into upgrade issues. You more often than not run into upgrade issues when you have core code components or you're trying to revamp something, obviously, as part of that. Melissa, my fancy green screen, thank you. Appreciate it. I do a stream every other Thursday at this point, and so as part of that investment, I got my wonderful green screen and my dream of what my house someday would be, minus maybe the I don't know, whatever, that cow on the back of the wall type of a thing. But it's a great little thing to have. So I know we've got a couple more minutes left. Is there any more questions that you guys have that I can help answer across Power Platform, Logic Apps, or any of those details? If not, a couple other things I just wanted to mention as well. When we were going through at the beginning here of the data concept with it, I just want to reiterate that for you. One of the components that I typically get into in our discoveries and in our questions is a lot of people like to lead with what they think the system did in the past, right, for it. And what they're really trying to do is they're generally trying to tackle something that they have to send a report to somebody, right? Or they have to take that data and take an action against it. And what they're used to, obviously, is then a report that they print out to get to that detail. One thing I would recommend to anyone that's on the stream that is looking at finance and supply chain management, or even the future of business systems, is to really start modeling your mentality around the data and the exceptions in data to be able to help you with your business. And what I mean by that is that instead of actually making it so that you print out a 50-page report and then you take a yellow marker and you try to identify those differences or nuances in the data to be able to take an action against it, instead, make the system work for you. Create a Power Automate that notifies you when a specific exception occurs in the data, because you don't want to look through and hunt and peck to find that detail. Make it so that you use tiles, for example, inside of finance or supply chain management to identify exceptions. An example of that, if you have EDI as part of your processing, why do you need to run a report to see a list of EDI orders that failed when you can have a tile that tells you that there's 4 EDI orders that failed because of a price discrepancy or because of a quantity discrepancy or availability discrepancy. These are exception-based interactions then that you basically design as part of your ERP rollout, really as part of that process. And then kind of lastly, remember that from a data perspective, try to think outside of the box, away from ERP, right? It's a 30-year-old concept now, if not even more than that, maybe even 40 years old. It's always going to exist, but now look at it more as that there's more app services that you can use, that you can interact with then to be able to tackle a business process. An example of that, field service. We have service management in Business Central. We have service objects in finance and supply chain management. We also have field service from a full process perspective, right? We could use field service to be able to integrate with Dynamics 365 supply chain management to manage inventory quantities in SCM, but then to use field service to be able to do the dispatching and all those advanced capabilities, right? So I would highly recommend, once again, to start focusing more away from let's use our ERP system and design everything inside of finance and supply chain management, to start using Power Platform and start using some of these other features to really make it happen. So I think with that, we're at 4 o'clock for time. Thank you all again for joining. Thank you, DynamicsCon, for putting on this event. And hopefully I get to see you guys in the future and answer any questions that you have. So thank you.